Sonora, summer of 1886. A dry creek bed at first light. A column of United States cavalry, riding 2 and 3 abreast, on the bottom of a stream bed that, at this hour, holds no water at all. The men in the column are black. The man they are chasing is Apache. The army that put them on this trail will, for the next 62 years, refuse to let them serve in any unit alongside white soldiers. This is the story of the Buffalo Soldiers, the 1886 campaign for Geronimo, and the long contradiction at the center of both. In July of 1866, Congress passed an Army Reorganization Act. The Civil War had been a year over. The country had 200,000 discharged black soldiers, and it had a frontier that needed garrisoning, and it had a small post-war army that did not have the manpower for both jobs. The act created 6 new regiments, 2 of cavalry, 4 of infantry, later consolidated into 2. The enlisted men, by law, would be black. The officers, with a very small handful of exceptions, would be white. The 2 cavalry regiments were numbered the 9th and the 10th. They were posted, by policy, to the worst country the United States had a claim on: West Texas, New Mexico Territory, Indian Territory, Arizona Territory. The garrisons nobody else in the Army wanted, in the years when the wars on the southwest frontier had not yet ended. Within a few years on the southern plains, in fights against the Cheyenne and the Comanche, the soldiers of the 10th picked up a name. The Cheyenne and Comanche fighters who tangled with them gave it to them: Buffalo Soldiers. There is no single agreed-upon explanation for the name. Some sources say it was the texture of the men's hair, which Plains Indians fighters compared to the dense coat of a buffalo. Some say it was the buffalo hide winter coats the regiments wore on the northern plains. Some say it was simply that the men, like the buffalo, were difficult to bring down once they were committed to a fight. The men themselves do not seem to have asked too many questions about the etymology. The men kept the name. Some of them put a buffalo on their regimental crest. You can pull a lot of meaning out of that name in a lot of directions, and historians have. What the men themselves seem to have meant by it mostly was that they were proud of how hard they had been to kill. It is worth saying plainly what the work actually was. The 9th and 10th Cavalry built roads. They strung telegraph wire. They escorted stagecoaches and supply trains. They protected railroad survey crews. They pursued cattle rustlers across the Mexican border. They served as a federal presence in counties that did not, in any other meaningful sense, have one. And they fought, often, against people who did not want them there, in service of a federal policy of removing those people from the land they were standing on. By the early 1880s, the long war on the southwestern frontier had narrowed down, on the United States side of it, to a single name: Geronimo, Berenkake Apache. His name in his own language was Goyali. He was not the leader of a nation. He was the leader of a small band, a few dozen fighters, plus their families, who had refused to settle on a reservation and had been fighting, on and on, for 30 years.
In May of 1885, Geronimo and about 144 people, perhaps 40 of them combatants, broke out of the San Carlos Reservation in eastern Arizona. They went south. They went into the Sierra Madre. The job of running them down fell to the 10th U.S. Cavalry. Colonel Benjamin Grierson, commanding the regiment, did something that, in retrospect, was the smartest move anyone made in that campaign. In the Sonoran Desert, the Apache could outride the cavalry, outwalk the cavalry, and outshoot the cavalry. What the Apache could not do was carry water for very long. Grierson put his men on the water holes. Every spring, every tank, every cottonwood draw a man on the run would have to come to. They did not chase. They waited. For 10 months, the 10th sat the water and the Mexican federales sat the south side, working under a reciprocal pursuit agreement that the 2 governments had signed in 1882. The Apache band wore down. They were never quite caught. They were never quite allowed to rest, either. In April of 1886, the Army got tired of being patient. Brigadier General George Crook, who had been handling the campaign with relative restraint, was replaced by Brigadier General Nelson Miles, who was not famous for restraint. Miles assembled a strike column under Captain Henry Lawton. The column included detachments of the 10th Cavalry, it included infantry, it included Apache scouts, Chiricahua men, hired from the same reservation Geronimo had broken out of, it included pack mules. Their orders were simple: find the band, stay on them until they were caught or killed. The terrain Lawton's column moved through was country that did not particularly care whether you were the United States Army or not. Daytime temperatures of 115 degrees, water sources 20 miles apart, sometimes 30. The horses lasted on average 3 weeks before they had to be replaced. The men lasted longer than the horses, but not by an enormous margin. The 10th Cavalry detachments rotated in and out as men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Over the next 4 months, Lawton's column marched more than 1,600 miles. They crossed the U.S.-Mexico border. They crossed it again coming back. They crossed it again going down. They wore out horses. They wore out men. They never quite caught up. What they did was make rest impossible. Now here's the part of the story that doesn't usually make the picture book. The man who closed the deal was not in the 10th Cavalry. The man who closed the deal was a thin, sickly Army lieutenant named Charles Gatewood, who had been told he was being sent home as too ill for field duty, and who instead asked to be allowed to ride into Geronimo's camp and talk. Gatewood took 2 men with him. Both were Chiricahua Apache scouts. Their names were Cayeta and Martin. They were members of Geronimo's own people. They had relatives in his camp. They found the camp in northern Mexico. They went in unarmed. They sat down. They talked. Geronimo was tired. His people were tired. The talks took 2 days. On September 4th, 1886, in a place called Skeleton Canyon, near where Arizona, New Mexico, and the Mexican border all run into each other, Geronimo surrendered to General Miles. It was the last formal surrender of organized armed indigenous resistance in the American Southwest.
Within a week, the Army loaded Geronimo, his band, and the Chiricahua Apache scouts who had helped capture him onto the same eastbound train. Same train, same boxcars. They went to Florida. From Florida, they went to Alabama. From Alabama, eventually, they went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Geronimo died at Fort Sill in February of 1909. He was a prisoner of the United States government for 23 years. He was never allowed to come home to Arizona. The 10th Cavalry's role in all of this, the actual ground truth of it, was not the dramatic capture. The role was the 1,600 miles of marching that came before. The role was the waterholes. The role was the months of nobody getting any sleep. The role was the long, unglamorous work of being everywhere a man on the run might have to come. There is a name in the 10th Cavalry's roster of the 1880s that is worth holding on to because the country has spent a long time trying to make it right. In 1877, a young man named Henry Ossian Flipper became the first black graduate of West Point. He commissioned into the 10th Cavalry. He served on the frontier. In 1881, while posted at Fort Davis, Texas, he was court-martialed on charges related to the handling of commissary funds. He was acquitted of embezzlement. He was convicted of conduct unbecoming an officer. He was dismissed from the service. He spent the next 45 years of his life as a civilian. He surveyed mines in Mexico and Venezuela. He worked as a translator. He spoke before Congress on Mexican land law. He never wore the uniform again. He was, by every contemporary account that has survived, a careful, dignified, cold-blooded professional who spent 4.5 decades watching the United States government refuse to admit it had been wrong about him. In 1976, the Army formally reviewed the case, found the original proceedings tainted, and granted him an honorable discharge. He had been dead since 1940. In 1999, President Bill Clinton issued him a full pardon. The 9th and 10th Cavalry, segregated, kept fighting. They charged up Kettle Hill in Cuba in 1898, the same hill action that became famous as Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Rider Charge, with the 10th doing most of the actual ascent. They served in the Philippines. They served in the 1916 Mexican Punitive Expedition. They served in 2 world wars. On July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which ended formal segregation in the United States Armed Forces. By that point, the Buffalo Soldier regiments had been a segregated force for 82 years. The Buffalo Soldiers were good cavalry. They did the job the Army handed them. They did it in country that broke other regiments. The job they were handed was not always a job a thoughtful man would want to do, and the Army that handed it to them was not always a country that thoughtful men wanted to serve. Both of those things are in the record. Both of them belong there. If forgotten corners of American history are your kind of story, the next one is already in the saddle. I'll see you down the trail.